Hey, thanks for stopping by. My name's Thomas, and this is Zarbo Audio Projects. Well, sort of. Today I have something for you that's a little bit different, and it's not technically audio related, as you obviously saw from the video thumbnail, but it's a project that could really translate into the speaker related realm with a little imagination. So here's the story. Where I work at, we're in the process of sprucing up our break room. And for the revamp, I envisioned a rolling base cabinet for our microwave and coffee maker. But instead of throwing the usual prefab laminate top on there, I thought it might be cool to create a faux marble type of countertop. Doing a faux finish is really a lot of fun. And I know this because I've attempted this a few times before. In fact, my arms are actually resting on one of those attempts right now. After my very first Zarbo Audio Projects YouTube video where I sat behind what was basically a plastic folding table, I decided I probably needed a real set. So among other things, I designed this figure 8 countertop for the set, and I used the same basic techniques to finish it that you'll see in this video. I've also used this technique to faux paint a hearth for a fireplace in our home. That was actually the first time that I ever did an epoxy pour, and I have to say that I rather enjoyed it. I think it's the perfect finishing touch to the dry stack stones and mantle that we created on this fireplace wall. Well, let's get to it. I purchased this unfinished base cabinet at Lowe's, along with a few casters to secure to the underside so we could roll the cabinet around easily to clean. Since this was a sink base cabinet, the long center drawer was actually just a clipped-in fake panel and not an actual drawer. So in order to get a little extra storage space, I built a drawer and installed some sliders, and just screwed the fake drawer panel to the drawer I made. Then I made this countertop out of 3/4 inch birch plywood. I gave it about an inch overhang on the front and sides, and in order to have it look like a proper countertop, I doubled up the thickness around the edges with an extra piece of plywood. I wanted rough edges for this top, something like a chiseled edge that would make it look like it was hewn with rough tools in a quarry. So once the glue dried, I took the belt sander to the edges to rough it up a bit and ease the corners. I used a coarse 32 grit sandpaper to do this. Yeah, 32 grit paper is pretty aggressive stuff. It's basically a few dozen rocks glued to a cardboard belt. So I made sure to be careful here not to take off too much material from the corners. The point of this step isn't to actually create that rough texture. We're going to use Bondo Auto Body Filler for that. What we're doing here is taking off the glue and getting the two panels flush, and basically just roughing up the edges enough to give the Bondo the best chance to adhere well to the plywood. We're going to sand the rough stone edge into the Bondo and not the wood, because Bondo is smoother than the plywood end grain, and it's going to look more like real stone when finished. If I tried to sand all this texture right into the wood, I'd end up having lots of splinters and gaps that wouldn't look like stone, and I'd just have to fill them in with something anyway. So Bondo, since it sets up so fast and is nice and strong, just works good for this. Body filler is pretty smelly stuff when you're mixing it up, however, so I try to apply it only in the garage when possible. I applied the Bondo to the front edge and the two sides, and I had to make 2 batches in order to get it all covered. Doing this in 2 parts allowed me to take my time a bit, so I didn't have to worry that a huge batch of filler was going to set up and begin to harden before I could get it on the piece. An hour or so after it's applied, the smell is pretty much gone, so the piece can be taken back inside to begin sanding and shaping. I used a belt sander for most of the rough texturing, and this was also the quickest way to remove all the weird blobs and pointy areas that usually happen when you're applying body filler. I was mostly trying to make it look like a larger tool had chiseled the edges. Here's what it looks like right after about a minute and a half of belt sanding. This isn't going to show up real good just because it's gray and there's no contrast. But try to imagine that, the color of like a marble paint kind of thing. And you can see it's going to look a little rough. I'm not going to go too crazy with that belt sander. I'm going to try it with some smaller sanding apparatuses to try to capture a little more detail. But stuff like this here and these wavy bits, that's going to look something like a hand chiseled effect once it's touched up a little bit more. You can't see it now, but you'll see it in a bit once it gets some paint on it. As you can see, I also used a few different files as well to get a nice variation in the texture on the edge. After I got it pretty much where I wanted it, I used some medium grit sandpaper to take out the coarse sanding and file marks and scratches. That's pretty much it as far as creating the top. I primed the top with Bin Shellac Base Primer. Since I wanted to go with a lighter color faux stone look, I went with white primer, but if you wanted to go with a darker stone look, you would prime with a darker color. That way you would need to use less actual paint when you go to apply your finish colors to the piece. Now this is the part where you really get to use your creativity to make your piece however you want it. I still remember how I felt the first time I tried this technique. Pretty excited, and also a little nervous too. To be honest, I watched quite a few YouTube videos before even attempting this. Most of them had you putting the color into the epoxy and then pouring that on the project, but I thought I'd have an easier time just painting the stone effect on the piece with spray cans, and then pouring on the epoxy afterwards. And as it turns out, it worked pretty well. It's not too hard to do, and I don't think it takes any serious artistic talent to get a realistic look, but there are a few things to remember when doing this. First, you got to keep the can moving. You can see that whenever paint is coming out of the spray can, my hand is in motion. Otherwise, you'll get puddles, and those wetter areas will cause problems, as I'll explain in a bit. Second, whatever colors you apply to the top, you also have to continue onto the sides. Grain patterns in stone usually go through the entire slab, so if you want your faux stone to look real, you need to hit the sides as well as the top as you create your green effects. Third, try not to apply the paint too heavy, and here's why. When you apply paint to a piece from a spray can, you're not just applying paint. You're also applying paint thinner, which is how the paint can be sprayed out of the can in such fine droplets, and also how it can dry so quickly. Too much paint thinner can cause issues when you paint on successive grain lines onto the piece. It can create a situation where the paint won't even lay down right and it just sort of scatters when it lands. That's something that looks a little bit like oil and water not mixing, if you know what I mean. So paint with many light grain spray lines, not heavy ones. Fourth, I laid down the darker grain lines first, and then went with the lighter ones around them. But, as you can probably see, after a while, I just sort of alternated between different colors the whole time I was laying the paint down, so I don't really know if there is a preferred way of doing this or not, but that's just how I did it. I used 3 basic colors to do this piece, by the way, and I'll list them in the description in case you like this particular grouping of hues. The most important tip I can probably give you, though, if you're interested in giving this technique a try, is basically don't be afraid. Like the late, great Bob Ross always said, there are no mistakes here, just happy little accidents. So if something doesn't look right to you, let it sit for 10 minutes or so and paint on some different grain lines afterwards. You really can't do it wrong, and as you paint your grain lines on, you'll probably get a feel for which ones need to be where. Keep in mind that even though I just used spray cans for this project, you can also use a little brush or feather or something like that to make the lines more contrasty in the piece to get a different look. Before beginning, it would be a good idea to Google a few pictures of some actual stone slabs to get an idea of what you want your piece to look like, paying close attention to how the graining looks and what direction they generally travel within the piece. After the paint was dry, I was ready to apply the epoxy to the top. I used Famo Wood's Glaze Coat High Gloss Finish Epoxy for this. I used the 1 quart kit, which comes with 2 equal containers of resin and hardener. It was about $25 at Home Depot. Here are the items you'll need to do this job. Vinyl gloves, a paint stirrer, a timer, a squeegee, a chip brush, and a hair dryer or heat gun. You're also going to need 3 containers to pour the epoxy into, and you should lay down some old newspapers or something to catch the drips as you work. Read and follow the instructions when you do this, of course, but I'll share with you the important things to remember as I'm stirring the epoxy. First, make sure your piece is level, side to side and front to back. This is really important because the epoxy is self-leveling. So if your piece is tilted to one side, the epoxy is going to want to migrate to that side, and it's literally going to fall off like a slow motion waterfall for the next 20 minutes or so until it really starts to set up. And while you're getting it level, it's also a good idea to raise it off the work surface by a few inches so you can clean up the drips underneath as it slowly flows down around the sides. I used the cheap chip brush for this, but a piece of cardboard or the plastic squeegee would probably work fine too. Secondly, make sure the piece is clean and free from any contaminants or fingerprints before applying the epoxy. Try and use disposable vinyl gloves when touching it after it's painted to prevent contaminants from creating areas where the epoxy doesn't want to stick. That happened to me on the hearth that I created, and I had to do a second epoxy pour to get it right. You'll need to stir the mix in 2 6-minute sessions. And now that my timer is beeping and we're all stirred up, let's get it poured onto the project. The third tip I'll share is when you pour the epoxy onto the surface, try not to get it too close to the edges too fast. It's going to flow over. It has to in order to cover everything, but if you work it more from the center out, it'll be a little less stressful as you go. You won't feel like you need to prevent everything from pouring over the sides. The instructions mention not to overwork the epoxy, and you can overdo it, but you really do have several good minutes to get it where you want it before it starts to stay put, so stay at it, but don't panic. My fourth tip is to look at the surface on an angle, such that you can see the thickness of the epoxy to know where you need to spread it. It is self-leveling, but obviously you can't just blob it on the middle and expect it to cover the whole thing perfectly. You need to get it close with the squeegee. And kneeling down a bit to get that perfect angle will help you see where it's too thick and where it needs a little more redistribution. That's basically the application process in a nutshell. Now after a few minutes you'll notice that there are a lot of air bubbles in the epoxy. You'll need to hit those with the hairdryer or heat gun. You can also use a small torch if you have a thing for fire. If you wait too long to hit the air bubbles though, they won't even out after you pop them, and there may be a little crater there afterwards. Then just brush the sides a few times to make sure there's complete coverage, and also hit the bottom of the piece every so often over the next half hour or so with the brush to even out any drips, and you're basically finished. It takes about 8 hours or so for the epoxy to stop feeling tacky, and 72 hours or 3 full days to fully cure. Keep in mind though, even when cured, it can still easily dent or dimple when objects are placed on it. It's okay though, the epoxy stays ever so slightly viscous, and it should go back to being roughly flat in a day or so. Well, here's what it looked like when it was all finished. I really like that shiny appearance on the top. I think it looks like a nice chunk of some sort of marble or stone or whatever where the top was polished really well. And it should look pretty nice on that base cabinet in our break room. I see that the edges are also shiny though, and I may hit that with some fine sandpaper in a few days to take down that shine because, you know, if it were a real piece of stone, that chiseled area wouldn't be shiny at all, as they wouldn't have been polished, but that's nitpicking a bit. Overall, I think it really looks good. Now, I know that this is primarily supposed to be an audio-related channel, and this thing ain't no speaker, obviously, but I think you could use some of these same techniques on a speaker or subwoofer quite easily if you wanted a finish that was a little bit different for your next speaker project. Take this subwoofer that I created a few years back, for example. I actually made 2 of them, and they're constructed of just the usual particle board, which I then veneered. But the tops of these are actually solid granite. I call them the Granite Titanics, as they use the now discontinued Titanic MK2 subwoofer driver from Dayton Audio and Parts Express. I had these 2 granite toppers machined by a local kitchen supply shop, and I paid around $300 for the both of them. Yeah, they really do look nice, and these toppers transform these 2 subwoofers into fantastically functional and durable end tables. But you could use these same finishing techniques that I showed you to create your own faux granite top for a subwoofer for a third of the cost, or maybe even a little less. Or you could use a similar grain painting technique to create an interesting faux stone pattern on a set of do-it-yourself speakers. You wouldn't be able to do the epoxy pour, of course, but 8 or 10 nice coats of clear finish would give you a similar result. And I can see that really looking nice, especially if they were painted with some finer grain patterns. Well, I hope you got a few good ideas from this video and maybe even gave you the inspiration you need to tackle your own faux stone finish in the future. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.